What if I told you the name you've always used for Jesus might not be the original one? That the name Jesus has traveled through languages, centuries, and even controversies, transforming along the way. From Hebrew to Greek to Latin to English, the name that millions call upon today has a deep and fascinating history, filled with mystery, debate, and even myth-busting. Was his real name Yeshua? Does it even matter which name we use? And what's the truth behind claims that Jesus was altered to hide something deeper? Today, we're diving headfirst into history, linguistics, and theology to uncover the real story behind the name of the Messiah. Get ready for an eye-opening journey, because what you're about to learn might just change the way you see history and faith forever. All right, get ready, because we're going to tackle a question that seems pretty basic at first, but I promise it gets complicated quickly. Yeah, we're talking about those different names we use for Jesus. Yeshua. What's the truth behind all of that? I think it's safe to say you're here because you want to know the real story behind those names. And frankly, who wouldn't? It's a bit of a mystery, right? It's even more mysterious when you realize that Yeshua was a name that lots of people had centuries before the one we know as Jesus was even born. So today we are diving deep into a text that really tries to tackle this question head on. It's a fascinating journey, I'll tell you. It's not just about translating words. You know these names. They touch on history and languages and theology, and even personal faith. So much to unpack. Yeah, okay, so let's break it down starting at the beginning. How do we get from Yeshua to Jesus? Well, you gotta start with Yeshua, right? That's the original Hebrew name. Now imagine the King James Version of its time. That was the Septuagint, a Greek translation of the Hebrew Bible, the early Jewish community. So that's what they used. And in the Septuagint, Yeshua becomes Iesus. I say, okay, I can see how we get to Jesus from there. Exactly. Is eventually changed to Iesus in Latin. And then finally, we get Jesus in English. Languages change over time. Pronunciations change. Spellings evolve. It's totally normal. Makes sense? But then there's this whole thing about Jesus being connected to the Greek god Zeus. Where did that come from? Yeah, there's this idea out there that the sus in Jesus is somehow linked to Zeus, like some pagan connection. But to be honest, that's just not true. So our source is calling it a myth, a total myth. Think about it. Those early Jewish scholars, they were the ones using Iesus as the Greek version of Yeshua way before the time of Jesus. They even used Jesus's for Joshua in the Septuagint, and they definitely knew who Zeus was. They weren't trying to mix those two up. Trust me, that does make sense. Yeah, so no secret Zeus worship happening? No way. All right, good to know. But now we've got to talk about Yeshua. Oh, yeah, that seems to be where things get a little heated. You said it. We're stepping into the world of those sacred name groups. Now, the folks who insist that Yeshua is the only right name for Jesus, and that you need to use it to be saved, they say it's the most accurate version of the original Hebrew, and they connect this belief to what Jesus himself said about coming in his Father's name, right? Exactly. They point to that verse in John 5:43 where Jesus says, "I have come in my Father's name." They see Yahweh is the Father's name. So they believe you has got to be part of Jesus's name too, which leads them to Yeshua. But wait, isn't that kind of a misunderstanding of how names worked back then? Like it wasn't like you just added your dad's name onto yours, was it? You're catching on. Think of it this way. Coming in the name of. That's all about authority. Like someone who represents their leader. They don't change their name to include the leader's name. They just act on their behalf like an ambassador. Oh, I get it. So it's more about representing, not renaming. Exactly. And there's a perfect example of this. Moses. He came in the name of Yahweh, but his name was still just Moses. There was no Yah Moses running around. Okay? I can picture that. But here's what's been bugging me. If Yeshua is so important, why don't actual Hebrew scholars use it? That's the big question, and it's one that sacred name groups kind of struggle with. You see, Hebrew scholars, whether they're Jewish or Gentile, they don't recognize Yeshua as a real Hebrew name. Wow, really? Why is that? Well, if you look at the grammar of the Hebrew language, it turns out that Yeshua just isn't a possible construction. It seems like it was made up much later, not a true reflection of the ancient Hebrew. And here's where it gets even more interesting. Our source reminds us that Yeshua was already a common name centuries before the Babylonian exile, right? They talk about those two guys. Name Yeshua, the Book of Chronicles. Both of them lives well before the exile. So you sure wasn't some new name that popped up afterwards, which totally contradicts that whole sacred name claim that it was changed in the Hebrew Bible to hide the Messiah's true name, right? Remember, the writers of Chronicles lived long before Jesus. It's like the timeline itself is saying, nope, that doesn't add up exactly. Plus, the name Yeshua is actually part of other Hebrew names that existed before the exile too, like a Bashara and Melchior. So everything points to Yeshua being the real name, a common name with roots, not some secret or changed name. But if that's true, why are these sacred name groups so attached to Yeshua? What's the motivation there? Well, for them it's about more than just getting the name right. They believe that using Yeshua is absolutely necessary for salvation. Hold on. So they're saying that if you don't use Yeshua, you're not saved. That's the heart of their belief. And you can imagine it's caused a lot of debate within Christianity. Wow, that's pretty intense. But wouldn't that mean that all those people throughout history who loved and followed Jesus but didn't use that specific name were, well, wrong? Yeah, that's a question they grapple with. They often say that traditional scholarship has been messed up somehow or biased, which has led to the true name being suppressed. So they see themselves as kind of restoring a lost truth. Exactly. They believe they're revealing a name that's been hidden on purpose by people who want to separate Jesus from his Jewish roots. That's an interesting perspective. But from a purely historical and linguistic standpoint, it doesn't seem to hold up. You're right. And it's important to remember that just because you question someone's beliefs doesn't mean you're disrespecting them. We can recognize that they're sincere while also looking critically at their claims. Absolutely. So we've gone from ancient Hebrew to Greek to English, debunk the Zeus myth, and explore that whole Yeshua controversy. What does all this mean for our listener who's trying to make sense of it all? I think if we take a step back, it shows us how connected language, history, and faith really are. The names we use for Jesus, they reflect different ways of understanding who he is and what he means to us. And it reminds us that there can be a lot of different points of view, even on things that seem simple at first, and engaging with those different views respectfully can actually help us understand things better, for sure. And maybe the most important thing to take away is that we need to think critically and really examine our sources, especially when someone claims to have the absolute truth, right? Okay. So before we move on, is there anything else you want to highlight for our listener? Yeah. I think it's crucial to emphasize that even with all these different spellings and pronunciations across languages and time, the core meaning of the name, it stays the same. And what is that core meaning? Yeshua, whether you translate it as Jesus, Joshua, or any other form, essentially means Yahweh saves that name itself. It points to the very heart of who Jesus is, the Savior sent by God. It's a powerful message, don't you think? It really is. It reminds us that beyond all these debates and arguments, the name ultimately points to a message of hope and salvation and God's love for us. But now I'm wondering, does the specific name we use really matter that much? That's the million-dollar question, and I honestly think it's something each person has to figure out for themselves. Our sources don't really give a definite answer, and there are strong opinions on both sides. So some people say it's absolutely crucial to use the original Hebrew Yeshua, and that any other form is messing it up or even betraying his true identity. They might even say that using a different name makes your prayers meaningless or blocks your relationship with Jesus. But on the other hand, some people believe the name itself isn't as important as what's in your heart when you use it, right? Like they're saying, God understands every language and sees the sincere intentions of people who use different names for Jesus. Exactly. They might point out that even the apostles used different names for Jesus, depending on whether they were speaking Hebrew, Aramaic, or Greek. So there's room for different perspectives, absolutely. And I think we need to approach this with humility and respect for people who see things differently. At the end of the day, it comes down to personal belief and how you understand the scriptures and the importance of names. But wouldn't you say that getting hung up on this specific name might distract us from the bigger picture? You know, the life, teachings, and message of Jesus? That's a valid point. If we get so focused on the name that it stops us from connecting with Jesus and living out his teachings, then we've missed the point. It's like arguing about the color of the lifeboat when the ship's sinking. You got it. The most important thing is to understand that message of salvation, love, and forgiveness that Jesus embodied. The name is just a signpost, not the destination itself. That's a great way to put it. The name points us towards something much bigger, precisely, and ultimately, it's up to each individual to decide which name really resonates with them and reflects their understanding of Jesus. Okay, so we've covered some pretty heavy stuff: merchant languages, how language changes theological debates. It's been quite a ride for sure, and we've talked about how important it is to think critically, respect different views, and stay focused on the main message of Jesus, no matter what name we use. I think those are valuable takeaways for our listener. But before we wrap up this part of our deep dive, I know you always like to leave us with something to think about. What's the thought-provoking question for today? Well, we've spent a lot of time talking about where these names for Jesus come from and what they mean. But I think the most important question is this: how does knowing all of this history, all of this stuff about the name, how does it affect your personal understanding of Jesus? Wow, that's a really powerful question. It goes beyond the academic stuff and gets to the heart of our faith. It does. Does knowing the original Hebrew name make you feel more connected to Jesus's Jewish heritage? Does understanding how the language changed over time make you appreciate how universal his messages is? Or maybe it just reinforces the idea that the name, while important, is ultimately just a symbol that points to a much deeper and more personal relationship with God. Exactly. And that's a journey that each of us has to go on for ourselves. It's not about finding the right answer. It's about reflecting on what this name and all its forms means to you. That's a great note to end on, don't you think? I do. I hope this deep dive has been helpful for our listener. I'm sure it has. And if anyone wants to explore this topic even more, I highly recommend checking out the source material we've been talking about today. It's full of fascinating insights and thought-provoking analysis. It really is a great resource for anyone who's interested in learning more about the history and meaning of the names we use for Jesus. Well, on that note, we'll pause here. We've covered a lot of complex and interesting ground, and I hope our listener is walking away with a deeper understanding of the different names used for Jesus and what they represent. We'll be back soon to dive into more details on this topic, so stay tuned. You know, one thing that's really interesting is that even within the name Yeshua itself, there's a deeper meaning. Our source points out that it actually means Yahweh saves. Wow, so the name itself is like a mini theology lesson. I never thought of it that way. It really is, and it shows how important names were in ancient Hebrew culture. They weren't just random labels, you know? They had deep significance. They reflected a person's character, their family history, even their destiny. So back then, naming a child Yeshua wasn't just about liking the sound of it. It was a statement of faith, a declaration of hope that this child would be part of God's plan for saving humanity. Exactly. It adds a whole new layer to the story of Jesus, doesn't it? It helps us understand how his name would have been understood in his own culture. Absolutely. It's like we're piecing together a historical puzzle, and the names are these clues that help us see the bigger picture. That's a great way to put it. And speaking of clues, our source also mentions those other Hebrew names we talked about before. Be sure, and I'll remember how they both have Yeshua in them, right? And they were around before the Babylonian exile, which totally disproves that sacred name theory. It's like having a time machine for language. These names show us that Yeshua was being used centuries before the New Testament was even written. It's incredible when you think about how much history and meaning are packed into a single name. It's not just a label, it's a story in itself. It really is. And it makes you wonder, doesn't it? Were there other people named Yeshua throughout history who just lived ordinary lives, never knowing that their name would one day be associated with one of the most influential figures of all time? That's a wild thought. Yeah, it makes you appreciate those connections and those unexpected twists in the grand scheme of things. Absolutely. And it brings us back to that question we asked before: how does knowing all of this affect your personal understanding of Jesus, right? Because this isn't just an intellectual exercise, is it? It's about how this knowledge touches us and shapes our faith. Exactly. Does learning about the original Hebrew name make you feel more connected to Jesus's Jewish roots? Does understanding how the language changed make you appreciate the universality of his message even more? Or maybe it just reinforces the idea that the name, while important, is ultimately just a symbol that points to a much deeper, more personal connection with God. That's a beautiful way to put it, and that's what's so amazing about this journey. It's deeply personal. There's no right or wrong answer. It's about what resonates with you. So where do we go from here? We've delved into the history, the linguistics, the theology. What's the main takeaway for our listener who's on their own journey of faith? I think the most important thing is to remember that this deep dive, it's just the beginning. There's always more to explore, more to learn, more to discover. The sources we've looked at offer so much knowledge, but it's up to each person to take that knowledge and make it their own. It's like we've provided a map and a compass, but the adventure itself is up to them. Exactly. Keep asking questions. Keep digging deeper. Keep searching for a greater understanding of the one we call Yeshua, Jesus, Yeshua, or simply Savior. That's a lovely thought to end on. And if our listener wants to continue exploring this, the source material we've been talking about is a great place to start. Absolutely. It's filled with insights that will spark even more curiosity and wonder. Well, on that note, let's wrap up this part of our deep dive. But don't go anywhere, because we've got one more segment coming up. It's interesting, you know? We spent all this time talking about names, but it makes you wonder, what would have happened if Yeshua had never been translated? Like, would we have the same understanding of Jesus today if we were all calling him Yeshua? That is a fascinating question. It really shows how powerful language is and how it shapes how we see things. Even something as basic as a name can totally change. How we relate to a person or an idea makes you think about all the different translations of the Bible out there. They're all trying to capture what the original text said, but they each add their own little spin to it, you know, right? It's like when you try to describe a sunset to someone, you can use all the right words, but each person is still going to experience it in their own way like that. It reminds us that faith isn't about finding the perfect formula or saying the exact right words. It's about having your own personal experience with God, something that goes beyond any language or culture. That's a great way to put it. And I think that's what makes this whole exploration of names so valuable. It pushes us to look deeper and really think about the meaning behind the words. So if we could give one last piece of advice to our listener who's been with us on this deep dive, what would it be? I'd say, don't be afraid to ask those tough questions, to challenge what you think you know, and to keep searching for a deeper understanding. The amazing thing about faith is that it's a journey, not a destination. And remember this deep dive. It's just a starting point. The source material we've been looking at, it's full of really cool insights that will keep you curious and make you ask even more questions along the way. Exactly. It doesn't matter if you call them Yeshua, Jesus, Yeshua, or simply Savior. The most important thing is that you keep searching for him, keep getting to know him, and let his love change your life. That's a beautiful thought to end on. So to our listener, thanks for joining us on this deep dive. We hope you've gained a new perspective on the names we use for Jesus and what they tell us about who he is and what he came to do. Keep exploring, keep asking questions, and keep the conversation going. We've explored history, language, and faith, unpacking the journey from Yeshua to Jesus and everything in between. But at the end of the day, what truly matters is the message behind the name: salvation, love, and connection. So now, I'll leave you with this question. Does knowing the history of his name change how you see him? Does it deepen your faith, challenge your perspective, or simply give you more appreciation for the richness of language and culture? And if you found this deep dive interesting, don't forget to hit that like button, subscribe, and turn on notifications so you never miss our next exploration into history and faith.